All right, so let me give a little bit of introduction. So today, if you haven't caught on, what we're doing is a little question-answer time. And so you can write questions on 3x5 cards, and there are ushers that are standing around. Be glad to take those. Just kind of hold it up, and they'll pick up questions from you. You can text it. Let's pop up that little text number up there. You can text it, and we've got folks who are going to jot them down and put them on 3x5 cards and set them up on the table for me over here. And so either one of those, if you're really brave, you can use a microphone, and we can try to field them that way. But frankly, on the cards is just a little bit easier to try to work that with. So what we're trying to do today is to give you an opportunity to ask some questions and then us try to respond to them. Now, the truth is, I've kind of looked through some of those over there and the ones from the first service, and there are bunches of those questions, probably 2/3 of those questions that would require a whole book, a whole class to try to answer that. You know, and I'm trying to do at least a half a dozen or a dozen of those, and so I'm going to give some very short answers. And it may be that for some of you, that just wasn't satisfying enough, or I didn't take quite the angle that you were asking about, or you're really wrestling with this. And so I want to say, first of all, that if we're not able to get to your question or we don't answer it in a way that's really helpful to you, I do want to engage with you. So feel absolutely free to shoot me an email, call up to church, leave a question. Be glad to write with you, talk with you, sit down over a cup of coffee, cup of tea, something like that, and have a conversation. Now, the other thing is, our intention is to do this again in a month, and probably then again in another month after that. And so some of these I'm going to kind of use to form what we do for the next session. And so maybe if we don't get to it today, we'll try to get to it to the next time. But what we really do want to do is spark conversation. If you've got questions that are really big and important to you, I'm going to try to help in a few minutes, but you've wrestled with this for a long time. And sometimes it's just a step-by-step conversation to try to help you find something that answers that and satisfies your soul. So, I did want to give an introduction to a topic because it's a pretty predominant one over there, and I kind of thought it might be. And you can ask questions about that or whatever you'd like. So, the question is, if God is all-powerful and God is so loving, why do bad things happen in this world? And especially, why do bad things happen to good and innocent people? So let me frame this up a little bit, and on just kind of the logic side. And really, there are three statements. Almost think of them like a little triangle. And the three statements are this, and this is the hard thing, is to fit these three statements together. One is, if God is all-powerful, if God can do anything, if God does miracles, if Jesus healed people, if there are other people who pray and people get healed, if people are rescued in the middle of dangerous situations, if God is all-powerful, so that's one side. The other side is, and if God really loves us, if God really knows you individually and loves you. And then the third part is, then why do bad things happen? And bad happens. And so it's trying to fit those three things together. You could take out any one of those. If you take out any one of those, you don't have as much of a problem. If God loves us and bad things happen, but God's not all-powerful, then He's off the hook. If God's all-powerful and He doesn't love us, then He's off the hook. Or if somehow you say, well, bad things don't really happen. And there are people who go down that road. You know, well, it's not really bad. You know, and you can pursue some Eastern philosophies and things, you know, this whole life is an illusion, or you just need to detach, or, you know, you take away that part and you don't have a problem. But you take all three of those, and now you got a difficult question to fit together. All right, so let's look at some of these. And so if you've got questions already written down, just hold them up and an usher will grab them and bring them down here to my card collectors. And if you have others that come up during this time, then just whenever, just kind of hold the question up or text it in. So let me just read 2 or 3 of these because they're kind of close together. So how do I respond and reassure someone who asks, why does God allow this? And why does God create or allow to be created innocent newborns with major birth defects? And why did God let children die from diseases that have cures? My niece died in 2007 at the age of 12 from leukemia. There's an 85% cure rate, and her brother was a perfect bone marrow match, and she was at the best hospital, and she fought so hard to live, but still died. And why do innocent children in third world countries starve to death? Well, number one, I'm just very impressed by your caring for people, and not just simply it's my problem, but you're caring for other kind of people. And so when I wrestle with this question, and I wrestle with it just like you do, I kind of wrestle in 2 sides of my head about it. And one side is kind of the logic side, looking for concrete answers, why, and give me some reasons, give me some verses, give me some arguments, help me sort this out. But the other side is not the logic side of my life. It's the heart side. Because the truth is, if that's your child that has leukemia, if that's your friend that passed away, lots of logical answers don't do a lot to address the heart issue and the hurt that you feel. So let me talk about that for a moment first. Because I think what happens is that when we're in the middle of really difficult times like that, or when we're wrestling with these kinds of questions, we feel like we're alone. We feel like we've talked to God, we've cried, we've prayed to God, and we don't get an answer, and we just feel like we've tried as hard as we can. Maybe you've even tried to help somebody else, and you worked, and nothing you did was able to solve the situation or help the situation, and you really do just feel alone. And I think then that leads us to begin to feel like, so where's God? Does God not see? Does He not care? Is He really not loving? The great scholar C.S. Lewis, who, and if you don't know much about his life, you should go read some. So he was this academic, feisty, single man well into his middle life, and then he met this woman, and her name was Joy. Never looked for love, never expected love, and God brought love into his life, and then she died. And he was crushed. And so he said, as I wrestle with this, my fear is not that I won't believe in God. It's what I believe about God. And that now I'll believe that God is nothing but vindictive or mean or uncaring. He said, that's my fear. And so the truth is, when we look at especially Jesus. Now, it's in the Old Testament too, but when we see it personified in Jesus, what we see is, I think, something that helps us. At least it helps me. So yesterday we had a funeral for Alan Smith. Wonderful man, great-grandfather, father, husband, who died suddenly and way too young from brain cancer. And so at the service, I was talking about that story of Jesus and Lazarus. You remember the story. Mary and Martha send Jesus a message. Your friend, Lazarus, the one you love, is sick. And it's just so confusing because it says, and literally the verses say this, John chapter 11, and Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and he waited 2 days before he came. And just like us, we kind of go, wow, really, Jesus? And so Lazarus died. And when he gets there, Martha comes up to him first. And Martha is like, she's the big sister. She's the type A driven personality. She comes up to him, really, pretty upset, frankly, and said, Jesus, if you had just been here, Lazarus wouldn't have died. And I mean, there's no mistaking in there. She's digging into Jesus. We sent you a message, you messed around, 4 days later you show up and Lazarus is dead. And it's real interesting, Jesus never chastises her for asking a question, for the way she talked to him, for the way she poured out her heart. And that's a great lesson to us. Let me tell you, God is not afraid of your questions. It is perfectly okay to take questions to God. And instead, then, Jesus begins this dialogue with her about the resurrection and eternal life and who he is. So Martha goes back to the home and she tells Mary, the younger sister, Jesus is here. And so Mary comes out. And Mary's a completely different personality. Mary falls at his feet weeping. Weeping. And asks the same question. Jesus, if you had just been here, Lazarus wouldn't have died. But her question's not that logical side. Hers is that heart side. And it says in that story in the Bible that Jesus' heart is just broken. When he sees Mary weeping, he weeps. Shortest verse in the Bible, right? Jesus wept. And then when he went to the tomb, it says he was troubled in his spirit. When we cry, when we weep, Jesus weeps with us. We're not alone. In Psalms in the Old Testament, it says that God collects all of our tears in a bottle. Now, I don't know. I don't literally think that. Maybe I'll be wrong when I get up there to heaven. I don't think there's like these giant shelves with everybody's bottles on there. But what a beautiful poetic image of how God is intimately aware of your life, of your pain, and your suffering. And he is not cold or distant or uncaring. God is heartbroken when you're heartbroken. In fact, God sees the whole world. We see that little slice and we're heartbroken. God sees the whole world. He's heartbroken over the evil that exists. That's why Jesus came. In Psalm 23, we quote that psalm, but do we really let it sink into our heart? Even through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me. So let me tell you, when you're going through those tough times, you are not alone. You might not feel his presence, but that in no way diminishes the reality that God is with you. And when you weep, he weeps. All right, that's the heart side. Let me tell you the other side, kind of the head logic side, because most of us then at some point, we get to a place where our heart is at least calm enough that then we can kind of begin to think through this stuff. And I think of those three sides of that triangle, the one I think that maybe we ought to ask more questions about is the if God is loving side. So, for example, I think one of our assumptions is if God is loving means that God would never allow anything bad to happen. We certainly wouldn't allow this to happen. If God really loved us, he wouldn't let bad things happen. And the truth is, well, that's not the way the world is. That's not even true in your own experience. So, all of us who are parents, at some point took our precious little ones to the doctor for all these vaccinations. Now this kid has no idea what's about to happen, right? In fact, if anything, they're thinking there's a lollipop at the end of this visit. And we go in, and we hold them tight, and that nurse comes in with a whole tray of needles and starts to stick them. And the wailing begins. And they look up at us with those little tearful eyes, and that look is just like, how could you let this happen? What are you doing? Why did you bring me here? One lollipop is not worth all this. And I don't know a single parent that doesn't get them. But we know that temporary point of pain and suffering. Now, in that child doesn't think that's temporary. That is their moment. They are living in that. For all they know, that could be the rest of their life, just sitting here in this office getting stuck. That's what it feels like to them. We know that it's some temporary pain that brings incredible good at the end of the day. And so that whole idea that if God really loves us, He wouldn't allow anything bad to happen to us, the truth is that just doesn't really cut the mustard. There are a little more sophistication and nuance to that idea than sometimes we like to wrestle with. All right. There are lots of other things to say about that, but I want to try to get to some other kind of things. So, all right. What is your favorite Bible story and why? Okay, that other one was pretty heavy. Let's do this. So, in the Old Testament, my favorite Bible story is that whole saga with Samuel, the prophet Samuel, and King Saul and King David. When I was a college student in Sunday school one year, we spent a whole year studying that. And they said, we're going to take a year and study this. I was like, wow, really? Because I think that's like 2 Sundays worth. But it was the most amazing study. And I just fell in love with the stories. And King Saul started off with so much promise, and then he just utterly collapsed. He was so messed up. And David is just this incredible character in the integrity that he had, and he's called the man after God's heart, but he's full of flaws. I mean, he was an adulterer and a murderer. And then he was one of the heroes of the Old Testament. So I love that whole story. And especially since we've been having the emotionally healthy spirituality classes, they kind of talk about how Saul was not emotionally healthy, and that was one of his problems. And despite all of his other issues, by and large, David was emotionally healthy. So I love that. In the New Testament, I think my favorite story might be the story of Lazarus. So Lazarus is this guy who's just utterly despised by everybody, right? So his own Jewish people despised him because he's a traitor. He collects money for the Roman government. The Romans don't like him. They just use him. And, he's described as short somehow. And so he's got this whole physical thing going on. So people literally look down on him, literally looking down on him. And I think whatever all that was going on inside of Zacchaeus, then he just kind of said, well, if nobody's going to respect me, I'll make them respect me. And so, he becomes this tax collector and forcing them, and becomes rich and wealthy, and nobody still likes him. And then Jesus shows up, and everything changes. He totally changes. He gets all of his scummy tax collector friends together and has a party and introduces them to Jesus. And he says, and I'm just going to give away way more money than I ever took from people. And he's totally changed. And I just love that story, because I can see myself in Zacchaeus. And I hope I see myself in the change that happened in Zacchaeus. So, all right. So, a couple of salvation, heaven kind of questions here. So this one says, can I lose my salvation? Wow, that's a great question. And there are some churches that teach that you can. The little town we came in, that we lived in Tennessee beforehand, there was a kind of a little family church, and they thought you could just lose your salvation for all kinds of stuff. They thought you could lose your salvation for watching TV. And so once a year, this church had a church-wide retreat, and the whole little church went out, and they all got saved again. They would all get baptized again because they had all messed up and gone to a movie or watched TV at some time. And the truth is, there's no biblical evidence for that kind of thing at all. You could lose your salvation if your salvation depended on you, but it doesn't. It's based on what Jesus did for you. And so if you honestly gave your life to Christ, it is in His hands. And it's Him holding on to you. I love that difference, a simple illustration. Parent coming to a busy crosswalk. And, if you've been walking down the sidewalk and you got your little one with you, you might stick your finger out and let your little one hold on to your finger, and, you're just going down the sidewalk. When you get to that busy intersection, every parent, you know what we do? We shake their hand loose and we hold on to them, right? Not them holding on to us. If it was us trying to hold on to God, yeah, we might do some stuff that could make us lose our salvation, but it's not us holding on to God. It's God holding on to us. You can't lose it. I think the other side of that is people who answer that question, then they start coming up with this list. Because, the obvious question is, if you can lose your salvation, then for heaven's sake, tell me what it is. Because I want to know what that is. Give me that list. And then you start trying to make a list of sins. You got to draw a line somewhere. There's no basis in the Bible for any of that. And the truth is, that totally denigrates how serious any sin is. And we're all sinners. We're like Swiss cheese riddled full of holes, sin. Every single one of us. All the time. So, all right, the other one that's here says, do I have to be baptized to get to heaven? And if so, by entire immersion or by sprinkling? So, no, you don't have to get baptized to get to heaven. There are a few verses that talk about trusting in Christ and being baptized and you'll be saved. And so there are a few denominations. Church of Christ, for example, says if you're not baptized, you're not going to get to heaven. And that's just misinterpreting those verses completely. The greatest single evidence of that is if you remember, Jesus hanging on the cross turns to one of the thieves next to him, and what does he say? Today, you'll be with me in paradise. What he did not say was, today, you'll be with me in paradise as soon as John runs up here and throws some water on you. Didn't say that. So, no. That would be about our works, not about God's grace. So, baptism, we practice immersion, and in fact, next Sunday, we're going to have baptism here in this worship service. There's been a little blurb. If you're interested in participating, I'd love to talk to you this week and see if you're ready to take that step. So we practice immersion because we think that's what they did in the New Testament, and honestly, for about the first 300 years. It was about 300 years before sprinkling and pouring became very widely practiced at all. So really, if you want to dig into a question, it's when you immerse, do you just do it once, or do you do it 3 times because it's in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit? That's the real question, once or 3 times. So, and we do other things at times if somebody needs to, either for a medical reason or logistically. There's a little bit of thin evidence that maybe a few times in places before 300 AD they did some sprinkling or pouring. So we practice immersion. But if for some reason somebody has not been immersed, but most importantly, baptism is your public statement to the world that you follow Christ. And if you intended your baptism to be that, we're not going to quibble about the amount of water, but we practice immersion here. Okay. Let's see how my time's doing. So I saw one here now. I got it covered over, and it was. Oh, here it is. Thanks. So in times of struggle, why does God seem to take His time answering our prayers? Yeah. How many people here have prayed and felt like God was just not hopping quick enough? Yeah. We pretty much live in a microwave society. We want stuff right now. And, I've talked about this before. I'm so weird. Something is supposed to be on microwave for 30 seconds. I don't hit 3-0. I just hit 3-3 because that's faster. Right? And we're all like that. We get to a traffic light. We're not all like that? Some of you are rule followers. You're going to hit 3. It says 30 seconds. I got to do 30 seconds. No, I'm a big rule breaker. I don't care. I'm doing 33. So, if we go to a traffic light and we're stuck at Midlothian and we have to wait for the second light, that's just like the worst thing ever. And so, yeah, we kind of wrestle with that. And the truth is that when God doesn't just hop to, like we think He's a giant vending machine, we did our prayer, we dropped the coins in, I hit B13, how come this Three Musketeers bar isn't falling out right now? I got to shake this thing, We treat God like that. God has a lot bigger picture than we do. And God may be actually trying to work to an end that's better than our short-sighted end. And it may often be that what God is really waiting on is us, because we're not ready. We're not really ready for that answer. And we think we want this, but that's not really what we want. That's not what would really satisfy us. That's not what... And so sometimes God, frankly, is waiting on us. And that whole process of prayer is not a transaction. And we treat prayer like that so often. Prayer is this transaction. I'm going to say this, God's going to do this. I said this prayer right, so God's going to do this. Prayer is not a transaction. Prayer is a conversation. And most of the time, a conversation where we're changed. And so we talk with God and we listen. We talk with God and we listen. So sometimes God is waiting on us. And I think sometimes God is waiting on somebody else. We're ready for this to be fixed right now, to be solved right now. God's been really, really patient with us. And it may be that He is graciously being patient with somebody else. And God has a big frame of reference. He's playing the long game. We play the short game. God's playing the long game. And He's forging our character, and He's reshaping us, and He's doing the same thing with other people around us. And sometimes that just takes time. And we're not always comfortable with that. All right, I read it in the other one, so I'm going to read it in this one. I've heard it said that we can be sure that there's a God because He made the sky Carolina blue. Then why would He allow those Blue Devils to defeat Carolina last night? And the answer is right there. Blue Devils. That's why. That's why. All right. So, once again, let me say to you again that I know there's no way that I covered all those and even the ones we touched on in depth. So, those are going to help inform for me what we do next month. But if you really want to engage in some conversation, I would encourage you to do that. There inside of your worship guide, there are some resources listed, and let me encourage you to think about that. So here are a couple of those. I'm going to leave them down here in the front. Please don't take them. In fact, one of them is not even mine. Borrowed it from a friend. This one called Confronting Christianity is a new one I found very helpful. This one answers in kind of some big picture terms and stories, but really theologically sound. This one is kind of, if you're more the logic, 1, 2, 3, cut, dried answer, this one that says 10 questions, that's kind of more that kind of book. But there's great stuff in both of these, and there's some other resources that are listed there. So let me encourage you to don't just sit there and stew in your own juices. Go find some answers from some other folks. All right, let's stop, and we're going to have a word of prayer, and then we're going to sing together. And it may be that you've got something on your heart, a prayer request, or you are ready to make some kind of decision today, and we want to give you the opportunity to do that. But let's stop and pray. Father, thank you for this time, and I know that there's no way that in just a few moments that I can really answer the deep questions in people's hearts. And so I'm just going to totally trust that in some way your Spirit talked to people today, that your Spirit spoke to their hearts and helped answer some things in their minds. And that if nothing else, then at least we've taken a few steps on this road of having a conversation with you and really listening to what you say. Father, thank you for this wonderful church family, for the great things they do in our community, and for their willingness to honestly engage difficult questions. And all this we ask in your name. Amen.